Hey everybody, welcome back to Introduction to Folklore. I'm Ian as ever, and today we're talking about folk objects, material culture, things, stuff. Um, it's the same. When we talk about material culture, when we talk about these folk objects, we need to remember that first we approach them the same way that we approach other objects of folklore, that they are performances, that they are unique, that they are present in context, that they are that the maker is bringing the resources of their group, of their understanding of purpose. They are going to be found apt. They are informed by a sense of connection with the past. They are nevertheless done at the contemporary moment when certain decisions are made. They are made for intelligently made for purposes, for moral purposes, and so on. They function exactly the same way as a story or a joke. But the big difference, of course, is that they are things. They have tangibility. They take first of all, they take time to create. They, unlike a story which might be done spontaneously, an object to be made requires a certain amount of preparatory effort. Not entirely. There are things that can be made more or less spontaneously, like cootie catchers. The fortune teller things that people make out of paper. That would be an object of material culture that requires a specific skill set and so on. But for the most part, when we're talking about something like a chair or a cane or a barn or something, those are objects that they are not spontaneous in the same way that a tale might be spontaneous. Um, and the other thing is that they last. They have substance. They're durable. They are tangible. In folklore and in larger circles, we'll talk about intangible cultural heritage as being a fancy name that the United Nations has put on what basically a folklorist would call folklore. Things, products of culture that exist only by virtue of humans continuing to do them. So, certain kinds of performances, certain kinds of practice, languages, um, enactments, and so on. But that the word intangible contrasts that with tangible, something that has durability independent of a particular actor. Once it is made, it exists in time and space. Not all objects last forever, of course, because you could talk about the material culture of. You could talk about things like an ice statue as an object of material culture, which clearly doesn't last, or a butter sculpture. You could talk about the laying of a table as an act of material culture, and a folk object. You can things that are just goods that are going to be used and are likely to be worn away. So clothing doesn't necessarily last that long, and it's actually the exception when we have an object of clothing from prior time. So the materiality of it doesn't mean it's going to endure forever, but it can endure for an awfully long time. This is a point I usually bring at the end, but since I'm talking about the durability of objects and certain forms that are less durable than others, one of the interesting things about how because you could think about the material culture as the things that are that can be placed in a museum because they're durable. They are remnants of a prior time. They exist from a prior time, and you can keep them. You can retrieve them. You can discover them. If you're sort of the anthropological, archaeological folklorist, you can discover them. You can bring them into a place. You can store them. You can house them, and so on. So when we talk about intangible cultural heritage, one of the things is how do you preserve a thing that requires enactment? As you know, it's easy, more or less, to preserve a building because it lasts. But how do you preserve a dance? You need to cultivate the wherewithal in order to continue it. But going back to that museum aspect, the things that if you think about what's often in a museum, they are objects that often have an intense durability because they are not made from fragile things. And they don't necessarily wear away in time. So the material culture of women is not often as represented in museums as the material culture of men, because the material culture of men is often dealing with materials like wood and steel and iron and stuff that just lasts, whereas the material culture of women is often things that are made in order to be eventually destroyed. For example, the laying of a table, for example. And of course, we're talking about an incredibly standard heteronormative gender division of labor, but if we want to think about the legacy of women, we have to think about the material culture that they produced under those conditions. And that isn't a necessary function. That isn't the necessary aspect of the material culture of women. That are the conditions that have been historically in place of the material culture of women. And of course, not entirely, because we do have quilts, we do have fabric objects, but they are less. They tend to be less durable. So historically, when we don't see these in our museums, we sort of have sometimes associated material culture much more with a men's tradition, whereas we want to recognize that there's just as much, if not more, material culture making among women, save for the fact that the material culture, the energy, the activity that goes into their creation is often for an object that has just a shorter lifespan because it's cyclical and so on. Anyway, so they're things, they last, they can, and because they last and because they're tangible, they almost take on the idea of objective, because I will go back to the idea that they exist in performance and that they're best understood as an object that was created for a particular time, at a particular place, for a particular community, voila. But knowing that they are durable, and the fact that they are durable, they can be taken, they persist after that context. They're, of course, designed, for the most part, we're talking about a durable object, they're designed to persist after that particular moment, and they therefore do. So they can be measured, they can be quantified in different ways, and they can also be repurposed and reused. One of the neat things about material culture study is that since the object exists, once it is made, it exists independent of its maker. So it can be, as it were, reperformed, or at the very least, it can be reconceptualized. So you have an object, let's just say a walking stick. You have an object that someone has made, and perhaps someone has made it and then they have presented it to someone else, and then that is, your grandfather's walking stick, and they use it they use it for walking. They use it, perhaps proudly, perhaps as a walking stick for special occasions as opposed to a more durable one. Perhaps they preserve it in part because it is a gift, but preserve it in terms of they only use it for special occasions. But then your grandfather dies and then it becomes yours, and you don't use it as a walking stick because you live in the 21st century and you don't really use walking sticks much. But what you do is you use it as a memory of your grandfather. And then you pass away, and someone else takes it, and they say, "Well, this is a wonderful piece of art. How do I use it?" Maybe you hang it on the wall. Maybe you turn it into something like something that, to hang a tapestry off of or something. So the object can be multiply used. When it passes hands, it can be used in a different way, which is kind of neat, because one of the things we want to consider is that folk objects are not always those that are made by the folk, because one of the things that we can do is we can take the objects of material culture around us that are provided by mass culture, by mass production, and we can repurpose them. So if you think about things like what you're wearing right now, you might be particularly crafty, but I would imagine that most, if not all, of the things that you are wearing at this moment, you did not make. If you happen to be outside and it's a scarf and you're a knitter, well then, screw me, I guess I made a mistake. But for the most part, I imagine that most of the things that you are wearing currently are bought. We don't really produce our clothes in the same way. The clothes that we do produce are very special things. Maybe like my grandmother made my prom dress, but your grandmother probably didn't make the 7 t-shirts that are kicking around in your room right now. So you have Old Navy, you have Reitmans or whatever, and you can get clothing from there. You do get clothing from there, but first of all, you pick it out, you make choices about how you're going to present yourself through objects, what you are communicating through the objects that you clad yourself on. You then have favorites, you juxtapose, you put these items into context when you're going out on a Friday night versus where you're going to church on Sunday, because you're all very good people, and or what you roll into class wearing. You are making decisions based on and communicating something based on material objects. You can repurpose them. You can take a shirt, you can cut it up in a variety of ways, and you can make it a distinct object. Not simply that you are using it in a distinct way, but you are modifying it in a way. So that's part of the process, and that's something to consider when we think about other forms of folk objects that aren't necessarily material. If we want to start thinking of, I'm going to save this when I talk about digital folklore, but you start thinking about like the creation of memes. You're taking images, you're taking fonts, and nevertheless you are juxtaposing them. You're creating them into something new. And by taking images and fonts and stuff, that's another aspect of material culture, that historically you're using objects that are from the found environment. So this is where I'm constantly switching back between the 17th or whatever and the 21st centuries when I'm talking, but hopefully to demonstrate that there actually is a continuity of our attitudes towards folk objects, if not necessarily a continuity in context, because or even in disparate contexts, because you take stuff from the found environment, so wood, so rocks. You know what a found environment is: wool. You find a sheep, and that is what you create your objects out of. Nevertheless, we have the material culture of industrial culture. So the really interesting stuff that is done with ironworks, and in Sydney or Pennsylvania or anywhere where there's like big steel plants, and you have people who are professional. But their day jobs are welding and facility with steel. They will often make folk art as well, but uses those skills and uses stuff from the environment, steel that is often procured from the plant, and they will make new objects out of that. So their found environment, again, sometimes we limit ourselves to particular materials because we are imposing an aesthetic of traditionality. That's totally fine. If you go to the craft center down in Sydney, most of the materials that are present are emphasize that they are locally sourced or made or grown in Cape Breton. Certainly, like the wood and the wood carvings and so on. That there's a sense of place and a sense of found environment within that craft. But that's an aesthetic. That's a parameter that someone is imposing on these things on occasion, and it is not a necessary condition. So you can bring whatever you have and you can create an object anew, and then it has some kind of tangibility. There's a skill. I mean, some objects have greater or lesser skills to make, but they are development, and then they become a demonstration of skill. They become something that because we can. In the same way that we could really see what a great story sounds like, and we know people who are particularly practiced at it, and they take the occasion to do that, and we take the occasion to let them do that. Like, tell a story, Grandpa. We do the same thing with objects. So that people who have a reputation for being a maker, and we know that their skill set might eclipse ours, and so their status can be accorded. So it is. I always go back to things like your grandmother's quilts or your grandfather's whittling or whatever. I don't know why I always go back to grandparents. It's a trite example, but I think it illustrates it quite well. So a definite skill set. And it's a skill set that takes time, and it's a skill set that then becomes manifested in the object itself. So although we can appreciate the story as it is being told, it is still nevertheless has that ephemerality. With the object, we can subsequently figure out the skill set and the intelligence that went into it, the sense of design. If you think about skill set, not simply in terms of how to handle a tool, but how to conceive of a project and how to meet the expectations of the community for what this object ought to be, while simultaneously doing something that provides you status in terms of doing it in an exemplary or a surprising and yet still nevertheless effective way. You have this aspect that's in place. And they are made from stuff, and stuff has value. And the idea that again, we don't want to necessarily fundamentally distinguish these as absolutes, but because they have durability, the value, the work, the labor, the materials that goes into an object can persist in that object. So We can talk about how the material often has a value extrinsic of its use. So the traditional use of gold, for example, you can take gold, you can put it into an object, you can manipulate it, you can form it, and it becomes a material culture good that does that same thing. It might be a gift, it might demonstrate some kind of status, it might have some symbolic role, like the use of the evil eye ornaments in Anatolia in Alpin Özdemir's reading. I'm just going to put a little link to that, to the video that I do for another class on that. And that, the gold has a value in and of itself, that is both has certain magical properties in terms of its reflective, but it's also a piece of gold. And so is something that you could recognize as both culturally valuable and economically valuable. And so it can endure. We can certainly imagine stories as having value, but they don't necessarily have the same kind of value that goes into a exchange economy, which is something to consider. But I don't want to just be crass, and obviously there's craft. Obviously there's craft economies. Obviously there is craft sales, and there are folk markets and so on, and you can go and get handcrafted goods, and dumb people like me from the cities can go like, oh, look at this, and buy something that is particularly distinct, and money can be generated in that way. But that isn't 100% the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm trying to make is that they can also be function as gifts, and gifts are an entirely remarkable category of material goods, because it's basically, if you think of what a gift is, it's seeding an object of value. It is, here is something that costs in some way. It costs a material, it costs labor in order for me to produce, or of course, not every gift is homemade, but we buy a gift, but here is something, and then I am seeding economic value and presenting it to you as a demonstration of our relationship. And that is a thing in and of itself. And so we might gift someone with a song, we might gift someone with our presence, we might gift someone with a dance, but fundamentally, when you're bringing a housewarming gift to someone, it's a thing, and that thing has a sense of durability. It also has the idea that, without even talking about sympathetic magic, that there is a connection that exists in that object. And we will often talk about the Barbara Kirschenbach Gimlet has this whole remarkable, perfect reading. But the idea that one of the things about objects is that as they enter into our lives, they become what she calls objects of memory, that they become occasions, many of them, not all objects clearly, but they become occasions for life review. She did a lot of work with seniors. She did a lot of work with particularly seniors who were either Holocaust survivors or survivors of of that generation. And you can just go, if you go into like any your house, definitely, but it seems to be something that accrues over life. So an elder's house, and they will have objects. They'll have obviously photographs where the person is represented. They'll have mementos, which will a memento reminds someone of a place, of a person, and a souvenir reminds someone of a place or an event. She'll have objects that maybe were created, maybe they created themselves, of life, of a piece of their life. So some people will do memory quilts, or some people will do paintings of their childhood, and they become these objects of they become narratives. They become, you enter into their presence, and even if you're by yourself, you enter into their presence, and each object has a memory behind it. I'm just looking around right now, and unfortunately the only thing that I can see that is immediately here is a chess set, and then once I pick it up, the pieces are all going to go. But hold on. So this is the rook from a chess set. It looks homemade. It probably was homemade, but at the same time within like a craft economy sort of thing. I think it's like from one of those 10,000 villages sales that they used to have. It is a chess set that is done in African art style, and I'm not a huge chess person. I'm introducing my son to it, and he beats me regularly, which is kind of distressing. But I have this peculiar set. So that's the rook. I will show you the knight, where they use a giraffe's head, for example. And but more importantly, that was a gift. That was a gift from my friend Virginia Preston, and so I've had it for years, and it's on display in my house right now. She didn't make it, but she gifted it to me, and it's not the value of it in terms of, oh, this is going to be worth something someday. It's a memory that I have of a loved friend. So anyway, I digress. But objects do that too. Objects become, because they persist, they have value that might be economic, but just as importantly, it is about they're often about relationships, and they're often about the narratives associated with other people. New objects can be created, so we can talk about things that are might be, a traditional skill set, but are applied to a new thing. I've already talked about how the utilitarian skill set of the manual labor of steel plants and so on then become turned into works of art. It's interesting when we do talk about craft economies and we think about the history of, say, just in the Cape Breton context, either Mi'kmaq basketry or Cheticamp hooked rugs, both of which were skills and the making of objects that were important for the day-to-day operations in those communities. You need baskets to store stuff. I don't need to explain the concept of basket to you, do I? And you need rugs for comfort and often for insulation and so on. Then outsiders, again, pasty people like myself from big cities, saw these and wanted to buy them, wanted those to enter into some kind of market exchange, and then also sort of suggested changes of the form. Can you make a big one? I need a basket that's like, yay. I need one to sort of, it's going to be for like my remote control caddies. Or I just want a small, my rug. I don't need a rug. I need a small thing. I want like coasters. Can you do coasters? And they're like, yeah, we can do coasters, I guess. And so they can take this and apply it to a non-traditional use that nevertheless retains that issue of traditionality. Objects can be repurposed. Skill sets can be reapplied in different ways. It's a distinction that is very, very notional. But sometimes we want to talk about that because I've already introduced the idea, but simply by referring to like the Craft Center in downtown Sydney. We will sometimes, and the we it's a difficult question, but sometimes people distinguish craft and art, and that art is a different thing from craft, and we somehow, and it's a very notional distinction. It's clearly based in issues of class. It's clearly based in issues of how we perceive the role of the artist within particular contexts. Like, is it only art if it's someone who is identified by other people as an artist, and that is their fundamental, foremost occupation, or they have been officially trained through prosceniums, sure, whatever, through institutes. They've gone through some kind of formal training, and so only a certain category of application of skills qualifies as art, and everything else is just craft. Does it imply the sort of idiosyncratic notion of genius that, again, we use in certain forms of intelligence, and then we don't label other forms of intelligence that way? Maybe. Again, it's very very notionally based. But one of the ways we can consider the difference, perhaps, is that most things that we might identify as craft typically have a utilitarian purpose as well. Are rooted in their utilitarian purpose. So, because just going back to our basic ideas, again, we want to think of these things in the same way that we think of all folklore. That artistic communication in small groups definition. We often will think about, like, in terms of language, that we have something that we could be saying, like goodbye. Goodbye is just something that we say, or we present some kind of farewell formula. But the way we say it might be culturally conditioned. Like, yeah, well, gotta go, gotta make like a banana and split, or sorts of things. We might introduce a piece of artistry to it that we know will meet the local aesthetics that we do so, and then we commune. So it has its functional purpose. These are the social functional purpose of a group temporarily suspending its co-presence to each other. Simultaneously, we have a way of doing it in that is reminiscent, that through the artistic processes reaffirms that group's sense of connection to each other, and so it's a formula. We want to saying things like a bowl, that a bowl does something. A bowl has a purpose to it. It does have a function, and there are, for the subcategory of bowls where there might be shallow and deep and so on. Different bowls, different sizes, and so on, and they serve different functions. For what purpose is going to be used: soup, rice, fruit. But then, how it's designed, certain aspects of the shape, the notion of like the lip, the materials that it's made from, those are going to be basically artistic considerations. The artistic consideration of the larger group in terms of how they understand bowl and how they understand decoration and how they understand the aesthetic value, and then the particular idiosyncratic gloss that one maker might have on that, have place atop that. So, how did I get to that point? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so, it's a notional distinction, but you might say that all material objects have a potential utilitarian purpose and an aesthetic to it. And are crafts the ones where the utilitarian is either its primary use or at least it's foregrounded? So we can think of things like, go back to hooked rugs in that they are, even though they are now almost purely decorative, that you don't put them on the floors. You don't want to do damage. They are so imbued with value, economic value, representational value, that you want to preserve them as best you can. So they really don't have that function anymore. Nevertheless, that function is foregrounded by virtue of what we name it, and so we're still calling it craft, even though there's no reason for us not to call it art. Whereas objects whose primary mode is aesthetic, and its primary mode is simply to be an object of value and an object of appreciation, are those things that we call art, at least in potency. And then we might sort of distinguish the art that you can buy at the poster shop, the paintings from Sears, as Billy Joel says, to the art that is in the fine museums. And then we have yet another class distinction issue. So it's a really kind of fun question. So material culture and the folk object is just this wonderful avenue for exploration, because we have these things. We exist in a world of things. And they demonstrate the same kind of things that other forms of folk performance demonstrate. An understanding of place, that they exist in context. It's not that all objects are gifts, but all objects have some kind of use. That they are created in part for the conditions of use, and the conditions of use are determined by the group itself. Oh, that's a good way of putting it. But they also persist in time, so we can look at them in a way that's different from how we look at another object, and they can take different meanings. They eclipse their performer, because they exist after the performer has done their performance. They're now in place, and other people can pick it up and fundamentally perform that object. and bring it into different aspects. I haven't even talked about the idea of like material culture being an important part of custom in terms of the dress that is worn, or even of course the elaborate. I mean, like a cathedral, a church is an object of material culture. Obviously, something of that size is typically supported by the institution in the state and might eclipse the mechanisms of the local. But you think about like the wooden church in St. Anne's, and that was entirely built by local craftspeople. And this sort of enormous wooden church, they wanted a thing that resembled sort of a European style pseudo cathedral, and it's entirely made of wood because they're wood craftsmen. It's a remarkable piece of folk architecture and a collaborative aspect. But using sort of the same mechanisms that they would use for barn construction and like. I was talking about things. I was talking about material culture that is part of our customary lore all the time. So that's a thing. But material culture is again, just to summarize, it's a thing. And so when we think about things, we can apply different levels of criteria to them in terms of we can measure them in a way that we just can't really measure a story. We can value them literally in the way that we can't quite value a story, because tangible things have some kind of market economy. But they can shift in time because they persist over time. They can be reiterated, reinstanced in a way that a story can't be reinstanced. And this is kind of a fun dynamic. The question of the week, I don't have it in front of me, but it is basically describe an object that's meaningful to you and that you have. Maybe if you've moved here, that you brought with you, that doesn't serve necessarily any real function, but is an object that it is important to you. It doesn't have to be homemade, but it probably has a connection with a person or a place. And that person or place is probably someone who is important to you, even if you're not important to them, because it could be something like a Rick Astley poster. But anyway, an object, that something is communicated through this object. If it's homemade, cool, but think about it. Anyway, I will talk to you soon, and okay, I'm done. Bye-bye.